Hello and welcome. I'm Jacquelyn Sundberg, and I work with the ROAAr group here at the McGill Library. That stands for Rare Books and Special Collections, the Osler Library, the Visual Art Collection, and Archives and Records Management. The ROAAr Book Club is not your average book club. At our meetings, you all join staff and guests to exchange ideas inspired by the treasures in the collections, books and beyond. The ROAAR collections are rich and varied, which means that the topics will vary from month to month. Today I'm happy to welcome Mcleod from McGill's Visual Arts Collection for Seeing Double, Photographic Portraiture in McGill's Visual Arts Collection. And here we are. What's coming up today? We're going to have introductions. Gwendolyn Owens, the director of McGill's Visual Arts Collection, is going to give us an introduction and introduce our speaker, who's Mcleod. And then we are going to have a Q&A after the talk, so we get to hear some of your questions, and I have some, I'm sure, about this interesting topic that we're going to hear about today. So before we go further, I do want to take a minute and think about the place that I'm speaking to you from. I'm on the 4th floor of the Macleod Library building, and the land that we're situated on, McGill University as a whole, is located on land that has long served as a place of meeting and exchange amongst Indigenous peoples, including the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe nations. McGill Visual Arts Collection and ROAAr honors and recognizes, respects these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and waters on which we meet today. The VAC is committed to strengthening local contemporary Indigenous art practices in Canada and is actively working to increase the diversity and visibility of Indigenous art across all of the campuses. And VAC is our term for the Visual Arts Collection. That's the shortcut to get there. So now you're all insiders and you can call us the VAC. With that, I'm going to pass the baton to Wendy. Take it away.
Thank you, Jacquelyn. Can everybody hear me? So I have the great pleasure of introducing Mcleod to you today. She's been our assistant curator since February 2020. Michelle has a BFA from Concordia in art history, an MA in photographic preservation and collection management from Ryerson, and she's a PhD candidate in the inter-university doctoral program in art history at Concordia University. I mentioned in the beginning that she started her position in February 2020. That is a moment that is etched in our mind as the last of the before time. So Michelle started her job 2 weeks before the pandemic, and she hit the ground running. Normally, when someone starts working with me, I send them all over campus, get to know the collection, visit all the buildings. Michelle got to do this using our wonderful collections management system and really got to know this collection. She's done fabulous research on the collection, supervised our interns, and as many of you know, she's the wizard behind our Instagram and our fabulous de-stress and sketch program that sends out a work from the collection every week with a little text about that collection. And we invite everyone to de-stress and sketch. And if you're not following us on Instagram or want to get a de-stress email, just let us know and we will add you to the list. And finally, I'm going to say that I know you're going to hear a great talk because that's how I met Michelle. We were both at a conference in Quebec City. You go to a 3 or 4 day conference of art historians, you hear a lot of talks. And I heard a lot of talks, but the one I remembered was by a PhD student named Mcleod. So I was thrilled when she applied to work at the Visual Arts Collection. And I am excited that she is going to share more about our collection with you today. So over to you, Michelle.
Wow, thank you so much, Wendy and Jacquelyn. That's such a nice, warm welcome. I'm so glad to be here today. I'm just gonna set up my screen here. I feel like I'm blushing. That was such a nice introduction. Thank you. Okay, so as Wendy mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at Concordia, and I did my master's at Ryerson. All throughout this study, I seem to have kind of clung on to photography, and it's become truly a fascination of mine. I had the opportunity to learn the wonderfully rich history and theory of photography during this time. And while I was at Ryerson, I was able to intern at the Macleod Museum. And it was there that I encountered a 19th century photographic album that then became my obsession and my master's thesis topic. And this led to more questions about the circulation and dissemination of early Canadian photography. And eventually this led me to apply to Concordia's PhD program to just keep asking these questions and to keep learning. So now my doctoral research is centered on 2 weekly illustrated journals published in Montreal that use an early photomechanical process. But while my research and my studies has been focused on 19th century photography, photography in all its forms has truly become my fascination. I think I'm most drawn to the complexity of the medium. I like how ubiquitous it's become in our contemporary society, and the dizzying rate at which it's integrated itself into visual culture. I love how photography has made some wonderfully complex interventions into the long-held systems within the museum, the archive, and the art market. As further proof of my love of photography, I have this growing collection of 20th century vintage snapshots. You'll see a selection of them here. I have been known to root through bins of snapshots at flea markets, and together en masse, I sort of appreciate the patterns and the commonalities that I see in this type of vernacular photography. For example, the whole family on the front porch, the bride in front of the car, the baby in the stroller. This sameness of so many of these photographs tells us something specific about the demographic using the camera, how they use the camera, and the moments that they deemed important enough to use precious film on. But as I'm search in the flea market through these bins, I admit I'm looking for those snapshots that stand out to me. The ones that sort of make me smile, maybe chuckle, a funny outfit, a silly pose, or maybe because it reminds me of someone or something that's familiar or recognizable in these anonymous snapshots. This quality of photography is something that I'll talk more about today. This unique attribute of the photographic medium that can affect us on a personal level in a way that might not somebody else. Photo theorist Roland Barthes calls this the punctum. This is a Latin term for puncture, and he chose it to describe when a detail cuts through the rest of a photograph's pictorial field. According to Barthes, the punctum is what makes a photograph, but not all photographs, visually arresting to a viewer. This, of course, is a subjective experience. Since photography is inherently linked to the physical world, what might be included in the photographer's frame may unintentionally affect one viewer, but not another. But when an artist can intentionally harness this response by making images that cut through the barrage of photographs that we see on a regular basis, that's when things start to get really interesting. Photographers tend to have a heightened visual acuity and an appreciation for how the medium works, both technically and conceptually. Today, I'll show some strategies that photographers use to create images that hold our attention and perhaps invite us to think about how we see photographs. Before I go on, however, I thought it would be helpful to give us a brief introduction to McGill Visual Arts Collection. As Wendy mentioned, I sort of have been learning remotely for a long time, and I'm very glad to be back on campus. But we are a professional team of 3, our director, Gwendolyn, who you've just met, and our collections manager, Hannah Deskin, and myself as the assistant curator. Together, we care for about 3,500 artworks in the university's collection, and we're also very fortunate to work with a team of dedicated and talented student interns and fellows. The collection consists of paintings, prints, sculptures, stained glass, tapestries, and also photographs. The vast majority of the collection is actually on view in public outdoor spaces, corridors, classrooms, administrative spaces. And it's here where it enhances the teaching, research, and working environments of the faculty, staff, students, and visitors of McGill. The university's collection of fine art is primarily built upon generous donations. These gifts have expanded the range and the scope of art by established artists in the collection. As I mentioned, since the 19th century, the medium of photography presented some challenges to the definition of fine art. For a long time, it was considered a threat to the graphic arts, like engraving. The mechanical nature of the camera was considered a direct impression of reality and a way to sort of circumvent the artist engraver's hand to record events and people. Photography was also deemed a useful tool for artists, but not a legitimate art form by major art institutions or collectors because it was too scientific. It wasn't artistic enough. The term handmaiden to art was coined by this French 19th century art critic, Charles Baudelaire, to describe the mechanical nature of photography, a medium that he decided was never going to be anything but an aid. And you can't help but think he looks a little grumpy in his photographic portrait here. We actually have a really great example of how photographic images snuck into collections despite having this sort of reputation in the 19th century. This portrait of Reverend J.G. Mountain in the VAC's collection is in fact a painted photograph. It was created in 1870 from an enlarged photograph, likely taken by William Notman, and it was painted over by an artist with oil paint. Many of the earliest artworks collected by McGill were these type of formal painted portraits, painted on canvas, and usually not done with the help of photography. And funny enough, portraiture is also how photography was integrated into many institutional collections, as it became a more common and a more democratic way of having one's portrait taken. To give a relevant Canadian example, I had the opportunity to intern with Maya Sednick at the Art Gallery of Ontario while I was studying at Ryerson. And she spoke to us about how she became the AGO's first curator of photography. This Canadian art museum only began seriously acquiring photography as an art form under Sednick's direction in 1979. Before this time, most of the museum's photographs were portraits of the artists represented in their collection, like this example here of Henry Moore, the sculptor. But these photographs were kept in the museum's archive. They weren't part of the art collection. Today, the AGO's photography collection is its own department within the university and has over 70,000 objects. And this is in large part due to the hard work and perseverance of Maya Sednick. Similar to the AGO, at McGill, we have a tremendous photographic collection in the archives. And I have been known to request many of these photographs. This is just one example of a gem that I found recently. And I think we're going to put the link to this database in the chat if you'd like to poke around in the archive as well. I suggest it. The photographs in the visual arts collection, however, allow us the opportunity to think not strictly about what or who a photograph represents, but how it's depicted. These images are different from McGill's archival photographs or my collection of snapshots or even our iPhone photographs. When we bring photographs into an art collection, we invite a study and a consideration of their choices and intentions of the photographer, just like how we would do with any other work of art, a painting, sculpture, and so on. At present, we have about 400 photographs in the visual arts collection, and a great deal of these are by the artist Charles Gurd. Charles Gurd was born in Montreal and attended McGill in the 1970s. He studied behavioral psychology here before continuing his education in architecture at Rice University in Texas. While he was an undergraduate here at McGill, Gurd was an editor of the McGill Daily, and his photographs were published in this 1970 yearbook. He was also a member of the Visual Arts Committee while he was an undergrad at McGill. This committee was a team of volunteers in the 1960s and 70s that undertook the care of the university's art collection. Today, the professional team of the Visual Arts Collection is indebted to the work of people like Gurd, who helped keep track and acquire new artworks for the university. Recently, Charles Gurd told me that he remembered working with the committee in 1971 to secure the purchase of a large soapstone sculpture by an Inuit artist. This sculpture by Ishiatak Ipili is still on display in the Redpath McLennan Library Complex. Some of you might recognize it. And I was happy to find a correspondence to Charles Gurd from 1971 in our personal archive at the VAC. After graduating Rice University, Gurd would go on to become an architect, and he also taught classes at McGill, Rice, University de Montreal, at Concordia as well, and the University of Victoria. All the while, he continues to work as an artist, drawing, painting, and taking photographs. In fact, in 1974, Gurd embarked on an important photographic project entitled Montreal Mansions. As a young 20-something, Gurd recognized that many of Montreal's mansions in the Golden Square Mile and on the west side of the island were being sold, demolished, or repurposed by institutions. These wonders of architectural heritage were changing around him. So for 7 weeks, Gurd shot thousands of exposures in about a dozen mansions. The result was a series of approximately 250 photographs titled Montreal Mansions. The initial impetus of this project was strictly documentary. Gurd felt that these buildings, inside and out, needed to be documented. In 2018, Gurd generously donated an edition of this series to the McGill Visual Arts Collection. Both Concordia and Macleod have another edition of this series. And in 2016, the Macleod held an exhibition of these photographs. A perusal of this series reveals Gurd's documentary strategies. Usually there's a few outdoor views showing landscapes and the elevation of the buildings. There are wide shots of major rooms within each of the mansions, huge foyers, grand staircases, drawing rooms, bedrooms, and even bathrooms. These pulled back scenes show entire rooms filled with furniture, art, marble, tapestries, and crystal. Then, almost like that show, Downton Abbey, Gurd brings us to the less visited places, the kitchens, the staff quarters, the stables, garages, even a tennis court. Again, wide views of these spaces show us linoleum, tiles, ovens, and cupboards. But what reveals the human behind the mechanical camera to me are the images of details within these spaces that clearly stood out to Gurd as he moved through these mansions. Close-up views of frames arranged on a hall table, a peculiar faucet, the way a painting is framed in a mirror at just a certain angle. All of these supporting images to perhaps the more systematic views of entire rooms enhance the voyeuristic feeling of this series. We seem to pause with Gurd as he takes a second look at certain things, seeing in detail just how, quote unquote, the other side lives. I'd now like to take a closer look of 3 photographs that I've selected from the Visual Arts Collection. My intention here is to demonstrate the type of thinking and associations that can come about when artworks exist in a collection together. It allows for connections to be made across them, and perhaps these would not have happened if they didn't exist in the collection together. So this curatorial intervention is about photographic portraiture, and also that detail that I mentioned earlier, the punctum, an element in a photograph that resonates with us. These 3 photographs that we'll look at together are the Heiress by Charles Gurd, Madame Albergue by Gabor Selazi, and Boulevard Saint Laurent by Daniel Fodor. All of these can be described as documentary photographs. This style is opposite of studio portraiture, where the setting of a portrait is controlled by a photographer. Instead, documentary photography seeks to capture a person's likeness in a rather straightforward manner within their own context or environment. The first portrait belongs to Gurd's Montreal Mansions series from 1974 that I've just shown a selection from. In this image, a young woman sits on an ornate wooden bench wearing a thick black velvet coat and a white fur collar wrapped high on her neck. Her hands are folded in her lap, right over left. With only a slight tilt in her head, she stares squarely at the camera. Behind her hangs a painted portrait of a woman that's undeniably a relative. The painted woman wears a 1920s silk gown with 3 strands of pearls coiled low on her neck. Her fur-trimmed overcoat is open, resting on her shoulders as she crosses her hands in her lap, left over right. Their resemblance is uncanny. The same square jawline, the same delicate nose, the same curls, and in this photograph, they share the same defiant gaze. While this series was mostly focused on the architectural and domestic spaces of affluent Montrealers, there are a handful of portraits within the series. These are mostly of household staff that kept these houses running, cooks and butlers. When Gurd got permission to photograph the mansions in the series, many of them were at the point where the original families that owned them were liquidating estates. It was no longer economical for many of these heirs who might have inherited these estates through generations to occupy huge residential houses in the downtown core. In fact, this portrait of the heiress was taken in the mansion located at 1475 Pine Avenue, which was built by John Wilson McConnell in the 1920s. This 67-room Italian Renaissance Revival mansion was designed by Charles Platt and was the family home of the McConnells until John W. McConnell's death in 1963. It was host to many grand events of this very philanthropic family, including a visit by the Queen. In 1975, the J.W. McConnell Foundation donated the house to the Benedict Order of Monks. When Gurd had the opportunity to photograph the house in 1974, he was one of the last ones in the house before it sort of changed hands. The family had already moved out, but their belongings were still there. And in some cases like this, the staff were the only one there to greet him and show him around. So that's why he took their portraits. In 2001, the estate actually went back on the market as a residential home. And actually, it just went back up for sale last year for a cool $31 million. This real estate listing actually lets us peek inside the house once again. In these images, I actually noticed the same ornate bench that the heiress sits on is still there in that grand drawing room. According to the listing, the bench is an Italian antique, and it was commissioned in 1425 by the city of Siena. In other images from the Montreal Mansions series, we often see framed oil portraits and photographs decorating the rooms. Like ghosts of the mansion's occupants, we encounter these likenesses rather passively as we follow Gurd's tour through the mansion. In this photograph, however, of the heiress, a real-life residence returns our gaze right back at us. The visual coincidence of this image is confronting. The 2 women, one painted and one photograph, hold the same pose and wear nearly the same outfit, and they give us the same expression. For me, this is the detail that cuts through. Their double gaze is a punctum. And as if to close the circle completely, Gurd takes his own self-portrait reflected in an ornate mirror hanging over a fireplace in that same McConnell mansion. Breaking the fourth wall, as they say in TV and film, this self-portrait reveals the photographer's presence in the room. Like a signature on a painting, this image shows us exactly who created these images. It is not an unauthored, or nor is it a neutral document. With each view was intentionally created and selected for the presentation within the VAC's art collection. In Gurd's self-portrait here, we can actually see his equipment that he used. On the marble mantle, we see his cameras and his lenses. He recently just told me that he actually borrowed one of these lenses from the Montreal photographer Gabor Selazi to shoot this series. Selazi is a fixture in the Montreal art scene. He's worked for many years documenting Quebecois culture, including the art scene itself. A recent show at the Macleod showed his photographs of art openings in Montreal during the 1960s and 70s, and it was a really a treat to see his work like this. Born in Hungary, Selazi fled to Canada in 1957 and began photographing rural and urban scenes as part of his job at the Office du Film de Québec. He went on to teach photography at Concordia and continued to gain notoriety for his intimate studies of rural Quebec regions. Selazi's work has been exhibited nationally and internationally, and he is a recipient of the Governor General's Award, among many other achievements. His skill as a documentarian lies in his attention to his portraits within interior domestic spaces. Selazi weaves these type of portraits with landscapes and architectural studies to convey a spirit of a particular place. It's clear that Gurd would have been inspired by this type of approach as a young photographer. In fact, many photographers count Selazi as an important influence in their work. In this photograph from the VAC's collection, Selazi brings us into a private living room and offers us an intimate view of his subject's self-representation. We see the deliberate and tidy arrangement of decor and the self-aware posture of Madame Guay. Like in Gurd's Heiress, there's a reverberation of portraits happening in this scene. Above the elderly woman is a large ornate frame that holds what appears to be a photographic portrait of a young man dressed in formal military uniform. To the right, there's two smaller circular frames that hold military medals and badges. Presumably, those are the same ones that adorn the man's uniform. To the left, there's two more photographic portraits of a man and a woman. We suspect that these people are relatives of Madame Guay, but perhaps the woman in the frame is her younger self. Regardless, these framed portraits allude to the passage of time and give this scene an air of nostalgia and memory. Curator and photo historian David Heiress refers to Selazi's photographs as environmental portraits, because Selazi's work explores how one's environment both describes and conditions the individual. Selazi primarily worked with a large format camera, a 4x5, for these early series. This type of equipment means that the setting up takes some time within the space and several minutes of the photographer's concentration. This type of shooting demands something quite different than the photographer who uses a handheld camera on the street, for instance. With a large format camera comes a very deliberate framing and the possibility for real exchange between the photographer and their subject. Therefore, Selazi's portraits have a very expressive quality that seems to be in sync with his subject. Here, the inclusion of the cracks in the wall and the wallpaper on the top right perhaps hint at the loneliness or the fragility of the subject's psyche. Lastly, this photograph by Hungarian-born, Montreal-based photographer Daniel Fodor continues our theme of double portraits today. A self-taught photographer who exhibited at local galleries, Fodor's style is referred to as street photography. In this other example of his work from the Musée National des Beaux-Arts de Québec, we get a sense of his sharp eye for visual coincidences in the urban environment. Here, light posts join a mural of trees on a brick wall to create an artificial urban forest. Street photography differs from what Selazi was doing in that it requires a very quick visual acuity to notice, to think about, frame, and capture these fleeting scenes, all in a very quick turnaround time. In this work from the VAC's collection, Fodor photographs a young man wearing a leather vest and well-worn jeans as he leans on a doorway on St. Laurent Boulevard in 1982. Behind him, we see a faint mural of a Charlie Chaplin-looking figure. The mural man has a short haircut, he wears a suit and tie, and sports a tidy mustache. Fodor's subject epitomizes the young punk scene of Montreal in the 1980s with his bold, rebellious stance and his back turned to a suit. But more abstractly, this image can also be read as a schematic representation of the photographic process itself. The doorway, like a camera, reframes the subject, the young man. The painted figure on the wall represents the young man as a shadow, a trace image of a relation between a body and a light source. The inconsistencies we see between the subject and the shadow figure or the mural suggest an unreliability of photographic knowledge. As we've seen in these three portraits, a photographer's framing, selection, equipment, and approach to their subject can help us better appreciate these images within the context of an art collection. In each of these photographs, we are seeing double, but this could also be a metaphor for how we see photographs in general, for it has been said that every photograph is in fact a self-portrait of the photographer. Switching gears slightly, I'd like to sort of pick up Jacquelyn's wonderful theme for this ROAAR event and the fall programming of new and noteworthy. And I thought it would be a nice opportunity to introduce more donations of photographs that we've accepted into the collection just last year in 2020. As a complement to the Montreal Mansions series that was already in our collection, Charles Gurd donated 4 additional photographic portfolios. This recent acquisition of contemporary photography represents an exciting direction for us as we continue to grow and gain greater diversity of artists and mediums within the collection. The overarching goal of Gurd's later work is really to toe the line on abstraction. As I mentioned, photography is tied to the physical world. Even if a photograph is abstract, it's still indexically linked to a subject. In these 4 portfolios, Gurd turns his lens on nature, searching for patterns and textures that appear abstract when photographed and that can be easily underappreciated without the photographer's eye. The first portfolio is titled Montagne Sainte-Victoire. As if an homage, this series of 25 photographs depicts the same limestone mountain in southern France that French post-impressionist artist Paul Cézanne painted over and over again. This was a 3-year study for Gurd in 2017, as he made a pilgrimage to this mountain that has now become sort of an emblem of modern art. On the frontispiece of Gurd's portfolio, he quotes art critic Roger Fry. This quote was originally published in the exhibition catalog for a London show in 1910 titled Manet and the Post-Impressionists. It reads, Cézanne showed how it was possible to pass from the complexity of the appearance of things to the geometric simplicity which design demands. Cézanne spent years of his life studying Mont Sainte-Victoire's form and color, transforming the intricacies of nature into bold shapes and brush strokes. In his photographs, Gurd also teeters on abstraction, often by filling the frame with the rocky landscape. For example, in this photograph on the right, a low contrast and a deep depth of field renders the texture of the distant mountain, the bushes in the foreground, and the branch overhead, all in very sharp focus. Here, Gurd is playfully using the inherent qualities of photography to flatten this view of the mountain and achieve the same graphic quality as a Cézanne painting. And I'll just flip through a few more because I couldn't edit them. I liked them so much. The second portfolio is a series titled Fractal Expressions. This consists of 19 mesmerizing photographs of ferns. Shot in the west coast of Vancouver Island, this series is a deep study, once again, of a very common plant. Further evidence of Gurd's methodical approach, we see in the frontispiece of this portfolio how he lists 4 species of ferns that are native to this area: the western sword fern, lady fern, bracken fern, and deer fern. On the opening introduction, the Latin names of each plant species are given, as well as a brief description of each fern, their leaf shape, their growth pattern, and their preferred climate and soil. The photographs themselves are entrancing, with a high contrast between velvety black and silver gray midtones. Here, Gurd captures the dappled forest light as it filters through onto the fern's delicate fronds, creating layers of fleeting patterns. There's both a softness and a drama to these monochromatic photographs. In keeping with his style, Gurd invites the viewer to pause and see the beauty and specificity in something as common to the Canadian ecosystem as the fern. The third portfolio is titled Screens, Trees. In this series, there's 26 color prints of various tree types across all 4 seasons. These photographs were taken in between 1993 and 2020. In this series, we see fallen golden leaves on an inky black pond in the Adirondacks to create an all-over pattern. A bare winter branch coated with thick ice, glowing green in that familiar Montreal streetlight. Cherry blossoms bursting against a clear spring sky, and the abundance of summer overgrowth. Within these 26 prints that are full size, like I'm showing here, there are 7 more prints that are either triptychs or diptychs that are arranged like this. In these assemblages, Gurd is creating relations between the natural forms of the tree branches and blooms and leaves and even their shadows. On the edge of extraction, Gurd is framing these natural elements and inviting the viewer to reinterpret something that's quite recognizable. And finally, the 4th portfolio that was accepted into the VAC's collection in 2020 is titled Ghost Trees. This series of 20 prints were all shot in the Gastaleo Basin Preserve, a conservation area just south of Santa Fe, New Mexico. In the frontispiece, Gurd describes this project as, quote, a study of the abstract qualities of the inanimate in the spirit of Minor White. Minor White was an influential mid-century American photographer and teacher who was known for his mastery of light and shadow. Like Gurd, Minor White became more and more abstract throughout his career and became interested in the possibility of photography to symbolize more than it represented. He explored this by photographing natural objects that were isolated from their context. In 1963, Minor White wrote, "The photograph is at once a record of something in front of the camera and simultaneously a spontaneous symbol. A photograph of tree bark, for example, may suddenly touch off a corresponding feeling of roughness of a character within an individual." In Ghost Trees, we encounter twisty tangles of root systems against cracked, dry dirt of the basin. The direct desert sun of New Mexico helps to create a texture of these rough branches and make them look like chalky, sun-baked bones. Like Minor White's work, Charles Gurd's photographs in this portfolio bring to mind metaphors of fragility, permanence, and life cycle. All of these prints in the 4 portfolio are printed on 17 by 22 high quality photo paper using something called piezographic ink. And this type of ink has 7 shades of carbon black in it. This expert printing helps bring about the impressive tonal quality of Gurd's photographs. while they look good on our screens today, in person, I assure you they're even more beautiful to enjoy. And my terrible iPhone photo here is not doing it justice. Gurd's images are certainly aesthetically pleasing, but they may seem at first quite simple in composition. But as I hope I've shown today, that they are made in tandem with serious looking, deep thought and study of aesthetics, art history, photographic history, and technology. All of this underpins the photographer's approach and intention while making the photographs. The result is a rich body of work that can be open to interpretation and study. And this is part of why Charles Gurd has donated them to the VAC's collection. So with that, I will end by inviting you to get in touch with us if you'd like to learn more or perhaps consult these photographs in person. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Such an interesting presentation. And we are going to open it up for questions. So I invite everyone to, if you do have questions, put them in the chat and I will voice those on your behalf. And Michelle and I will have a bit of a conversation back and forth here. And yes, I think you should leave up something lovely on screen. I had a question early on in your presentation. You mentioned that photography was regarded as a handmaiden rather than as the main event. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that transition happened? Because now clearly photography is art in itself. But I'm just curious about how that transition took place and kind of when.
Yeah, definitely. I have to admit, I sort of glossed over a huge part of photographic history in this presentation, of course. So while that's sort of happening, there's these great debates between, is it too scientific? Is it just a tool? But then there was, of course, these artists and practitioners who were making space for photography to be considered an artwork. The photo successionists, the pictorialists, all throughout the late 19th to early 20th century were sort of experimenting with the medium to bring about its expressive qualities. Early days, that was sort of a way to kind of meet the level of what was considered art, fine art at that time. We saw a lot of photographers experimenting with processes that allowed them to manipulate the image. There's sort of like brush work and after effects happening in the darkroom that gave them sort of a painterly quality. And then, like fast forward into the mid-century of the 20th century, again, a real crash course here. There was, the argument to be made that straight photography is as beautiful as these painterly types of photographs. So that's where we see photographers like Minor White coming in. Does that answer your question of my quick overview?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm sure if we want a tour of the history of photography, I know Macleod's collections, the history of photography are significant. And as you mentioned in your slides, some of the artists you talked about today had their work exhibited there in recent years. One question that came in and is quite relevant is Charles Gurd still taking photos? Is he still creating new work?
He is. I think that this represents his most recent work. And I think when he approached Wendy and I with these portfolios, he considered this more of his artistic expression of his practice. And he's also a painter as well. So he's been painting as well. So he's doing things that are a bit more abstract expressionist as well. So you can see sort of a correlation between this later work and his paintings as well.
Can you refresh my memory? I don't know if I caught the dimensions correctly. For the most recent series, you said that there was two different layouts. There was a triptych or diptych layout for some of these photos and larger ones as well. What's the size to give us a sense, because we can't see them in person? What's the size of what we're looking at here?
I tried to include our fragile tape as reference and scissors here.
And the scissors, right.
So they're 17 by 22 inches. So all four of the portfolios came, and they came to us in these beautiful archival boxes too, which is a bit of a treat for us.
Yeah, it's lovely. And hopefully in the not too distant future, maybe I can see them in person.
Yes, please come visit.
Yeah. One other question that came from me, actually. You mentioned that there is a letter in the VAC's archives about the acquisition of this soapstone sculpture back in the 70s that Charles Gurd was on the committee for. My question is, how have things changed in terms of acquiring new artworks in 2020, 2021? Is the process still similar to what it was in the 70s, or have your acquisition policies and things changed?
Yeah, I think it definitely has changed since then. I think the VAC, or the Visual Arts Committee, did a lot of that work because it felt that it needed to be done, and I think they were right. Now when we acquire work, if we're approached with a donation, we consider it within the context of where we want the collection to go and what we want it to represent. As you mentioned at the beginning, we're right now dedicated to the artworks in the collection representing more of the McGill community and the diversity that we see on campus. So that's sort of our strategy right now for collecting. But when we get an offer, we do our research and we think about it in terms of our goals. And then we actually have a procedure where we have an acquisitions committee, which includes internal and external members, before we formally accept a donation into the collection. So I'm sure things have changed, probably a bit more paperwork these days than there were back then.
Yeah, that's likely the case. We have the ability to create paperwork and photos at an alarming rate.
That's the truth.
Yeah. Someone would like to elaborate a little bit more on street photography and your comment about its influence on the unreliability of photography. What was that sort of relationship?
Sure. So street photography it's so fascinating because I think what always, the punctum, perhaps the thing that stands out to me is that these photographers are able to see and think so quickly on their feet in oftentimes very busy places to get these photographs. And it's really about the intention of the photographer as they work. A lot of street photographers, sort of the famous ones, names that we might have heard of, Gary Winogrand is one of my favorites. It's an American photographer. They are known to shoot an extraordinary amount of film on the go. They call it shooting from the hip to get these kind of, fast-paced shots. And then it was really about editing what they got, maybe at the end of the day, going through the contact sheets and sort of selecting and seeing and looking for those moments that are arresting to us, to them. So it's sort of it's like a twofold system of being out there on the street and shooting, and then also kind of selecting from what they've got for the day.
Yeah, and you mentioned that for the Montreal Mansions series that Charles Gurd used a different installation, of course, like a tripod setup and a specific large format camera. Can you tell me, I'm a complete novice. I don't know what that means. So maybe could you just explain?
Sure. Yeah. So if I feel like I'm not a practitioner of photography myself, so this might make, if there's people in the crowd who might be cringy, but from my understanding, a medium format camera, a large format camera, the actual negative is bigger than just the 35 millimeter that we've seen. And what that means is it can pull in more light, and you can usually get more detail, like a higher resolution of your exposure. But it does mean like the camera itself is quite big, and it requires a tripod and sometimes special lighting, all of these things. Yes, iPhone cameras now do predominate. I'm guilty myself of that. But it's funny though, iPhone cameras now, we tend to use them as our notepads more than, artistic tools.
True. However, Apple does have that campaign of
yes, it's
beautiful
true.
photos that with the tagline "shot on an iPhone." So the tools have definitely changed. And
Yeah.
for some people, there's now an art form and a style that comes from the phone itself, the tool itself. And Chris wants to know, he's a big fan of Gabor Szilasi's work, and he wants to know a little bit more about the collection that's on loan to the VAC at the moment.
The collection that's on loan
Of his
to,
work.
oh, the ones that we've shown today?
Yeah.
Yes, they are on loan. I'm sorry to be flicking through. They come from the Blelma and Arthur Sundberg collection. They are on loan to the VAC currently as we sort of process them into the collection, but they are part of the collection now. But we just have that one photograph in our collection by Gabor Selazi. So which is why I wanted to show it today as an example and put it in dialogue with Charles Gurd's work, which was really neat to learn that Gabor Selazi lent Charles his lens. I think that's so indicative of how influential Gabor Selazi is in the Canadian and beyond photographic scene.
Yeah, the work was incredible that we saw today. So it's really, even though it's a largely monochromatic presentation you showed us today, it's beautiful. And the contrast in tones and textures is all the more remarkable for being monochromatic in shades of black and gray. I noticed, for instance, in the photo, with the textured wallpaper and the cracks at the edge of the frame, the wallpaper for me was the show stealer. If you can flip back to
I
that
will.
photo.
Sorry, I might give
This
you
is
all
the
a
one,
headache here. This is by Gabor Szilasi. Sorry.
Yes, here's the high-speed version. Yes,
Yeah.
This is the one that's already in the VAC collection.
Yes.
Yes. And it's interesting, this idea of the punctum. I think that my understanding of it is that it could be subjective. It could be a different thing.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, it's such a handy theory to think about photography because it is so subjective. And of course, like you might have not noticed the crack in the wall. You might have been fixated on something else. But that's what's so interesting, because photography, we are reliant on the physical world, this indexical relationship with the subject and the final artwork, is that it can sort of hit someone in a different way than someone else. And it's kind of neat to have these exchanges with photographs like that.
Yeah.
So I sort of perhaps I was a bit heavy-handed in my descriptions, but others you can just say in the chat if your other punctums that you notice.
Yeah. No, I appreciate the guided description. We have some interesting comments in the chat, actually. One about the photo of Madame Marie Tremblay. And one of the participants in the crowd actually met her, which is remarkable. She still looks the same. It looked the same then. Anyways, yeah. A note also from the chat, just for everyone, we do actually have some more Szilasi photos in the Rare Books Special Collections. From 1970s.
More to discover. My mistake.
Yes,
thank you.
More to discover. So we will put links in the chat. And we will send out a follow-up email to everyone with links to the VAC's website and some places to get started with photo research. There's time for maybe one or two more questions if someone has them. But if not, I think we will pass it over to Nathalie Cooke for a few closing comments. So Nathalie, if you want to take it away.
Thank you so much. Michelle, that was extraordinary. When I think back over the talks I've heard, there's one that stood out for a long time by a colleague called Martha Langford, who spoke about the genre of the snapshot. And today what you were able to do for me was give a talk that's another highlight of my memory of talks. So thank you so much. And thank you so much for giving us a tour of the photographs in the collection, which we very seldom see. And I'm the Associate Dean of ROAAR. I work very closely with these collections, and it's just such a treat to have the luxury to really look at these images and hear about them in detail. So thank you so much. It really has increased our appreciation. Your ears should be burning with all of the compliments that are in the chat when you have a chance to look at it.
Thank you, Nathalie.
So thank you to Jacquelyn and to Wendy for helping us host this wonderful event. And thanks also to the library team who make it possible. You haven't seen her, but Labiba Faiza has been in the background making sure that things are running smoothly. You're noticing in my background too another object from the Visual Arts Collection, this time a tapestry. So thank you to the Visual Arts Collection for sharing their treasures across the buildings at McGill. These events are possible because of generous donors, funding from the Social Sciences and Humanities of Canada, and specifically private sponsors Ron Harvey and Doug Bagley. So big thank yous to them. If you'd like a tactile way of exploring our collections, and you want to hear more from Michelle, actually, you can buy a copy of A Maze, a McGill A to Z experience. It's an alphabet book with movable images. And fittingly, you'll see that Michelle's entry on Q, which stands for Kikitaluq, a location of the Kinget Cooperative that produces stunning artworks, will be one of the highlights. And it comes just before, or actually just after, P for the printing press, which is a nice segue. I'm going the wrong way here. A nice segue into describing our next event, which is on November the 17th, also at 4 p.m. And will actually be in our Book Arts Lab, where we have this press restored and functioning. And it will be pulling prints with George Walker. And that will be a conversation as well as a demonstration of the Book Arts Lab in operation. So thank you, Michelle. Thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to the contributors in the chat who really enriched the conversation. Looking forward to seeing you on the 17th, and have a good evening.